Welcome to episode 7 of GMOs Revealed. I'm your host, Dr. Patrick Gentempo. And we've got something very unique as the first interview for episode 7. Tony Bark interviews a farm consultant named Robert Sake. Now, here's what's unique and interesting about this. He is very pro-GMO, and he was also, I would think, a little cocky or arrogant. And throughout the interview, he's saying, oh, you'll never say this, you'll never leave this in, you're going to edit this out. So we decided to air the entire thing and let it be shown. We have nothing that we're afraid of to show you, and I want you to see what the other side looks like for the people who are pro-GMO. Now, I'm going to tell you, because we did the entire thing unedited, it starts out a little bit slow, but boy, does it heat up. And I'm going to let you be the judge. You look at Tony interviewing this person, you see the information that comes out, and you draw your own conclusions. So I think this is a unique twist. I think you're going to enjoy it, and I can tell you it gets pretty fiery. So give that one a good look. Then after that, I'm interviewing Greg Horn. I've known Greg Horn for many years. He's the former CEO of GNC Stores. He's spent his life in health and nutrition. And Greg has special expertise and unique context when it comes to GMOs. So take a look at that interview. I think you're going to find it to be fascinating. Enjoy this episode.
I'd like to start out with you telling me your name and what you do, what your business is, the name of your business. So if you could just give me a brief introduction.
Sure, Tony. My name is Robert Sake, and I'm the founder and the CEO of the AgriTrend group of companies. I'm a farm boy, grew up on a farm in northeastern Alberta, currently live in Red Deer, Alberta, and our organization helps coach farmers. So we have 6 different disciplines that we work with farmers in the areas of growing the crop, selling the crop, and managing the money. So we have coaches that work as agronomists, we have coaches that work at geospatial integration, technology integration. I have coaches that work on grain marketing strategies, and I have coaches that work on farm business management strategies such as balance sheet and succession issues. We manage all that on an integrated strategy, a data system that moves the data from growing the crop, selling the crop, managing the money in a completely integrated fashion. So it's a pretty unique business. We have 28 PhDs and masters in our organization. And we don't sell fertilizer, chemical, seed. We don't sell any crop protection products. We don't buy grain. We don't sell equipment. So we get paid by integrating ideas and technology and providing leadership to farmers through technology integration and science integration and data management services. And we help farmers make better decisions and give them confidence. So our work really is helping farmers allocate scarce resources to produce a safe, reliable, and profitable food supply in an environmentally sustainable manner. I also have the opportunity and the privilege in agriculture to travel extensively, and I've been able to travel a good chunk of the world in agriculture, observing what's going on in our industry.
So it sounds like your business is a very holistic or integrated business in terms of being a consultant, financial and maybe business planning for farmers, for commercial farmers.
Yeah,
is that really
our legacy company? The biggest part of our business really is the agronomy. So I've got a Bachelor of Science degree in agriculture, so I'm not a PhD or master's or anything, but my trade would be plant physiology, crop nutrition, and soil chemistry. So that's my strength. But through the course of time, through the 17 plus years we've been building AgriTrend, I've migrated my role more into business management. And I spend actually a lot of time these days on technology integration. So satellite integration, sensor integration, and data management is where I'm spending a lot of my time these days. But we have a very powerful organization on the ground that works with farmers literally from all across Canada, and as far north as you can farm in Canada, all the way down through the Pacific Northwest, through North Dakota, South Dakota. We have business going on in Iowa, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi. We're looking at opportunities right now in Connecticut and Delaware and Washington State. So we deal with all kinds of crops, and we deal with all kinds of farmers, So that's kind of our business.
And so you're not consulting internationally yet. It's really North America.
We've done some work in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Russia. I've traveled extensively in Europe. I've spent some time in Kenya on the ground, and I've done work in Brazil, Argentina. I've traveled Peru, and we're incorporated in Australia right now as well. We haven't got active operations in Australia, but we're incorporated in Australia.
So you're really international.
Yeah.
So it's not just
and
consulting
we're
for,
growing.
for farmers in Canada and in parts of the U.S., it's for farmers all over the world.
Yep. So I've been able to observe agriculture globally, and it's fun. It's a great business.
And how many years have you been doing this for?
My whole life. I started out as a farm kid, renting farmland when I was 14 years old, and then I migrated into my degree through the University of Alberta, and then got into the whole business of farming. I bought some land when I was 21. I missed the peak of the interest rates by about a week, so I had 18% interest rates. So I understand that side of farming.
So how many years has Agritrend been in business?
We incorporated our company and founded it in 1997. So it's been 17, going on 18 years now that we've been in operation.
Well, and that brings an interesting question up, because in 1997, at least in the United States, I'm not sure about Canada, I think, is really when we started seeing GM crops being planted in a large way. I mean, that was really around the time that things switched over, that we really started seeing the increase in planting of GM seeds.
No question. Genetically engineered crops started making their way significantly into Canada with the introduction of genetically modified canola. And that's been one of the strongest examples in Canada anyways of a GE crop that we started. And I think your timing is about right. That circa 95 is when it started to really become a very important part of the work that farmers were doing. Yeah.
So tell me about that. You feel it's a very important part. I'd like to hear about that. And I mean, you started your business as GM was already just booming. So it would have been interesting to hear if Agritrend was in business, let's say 89, what the difference was in 97 when we started seeing canola and soy and corn in really to a large scale being planted in terms of its not just conventional, but the genetically modified.
Well, that's really interesting, because growing up as a farm kid, and growing back then what was called rapeseed, and then migrating to open pollinated canola, which was a predecessor to genetically engineered canola. So as I worked on the farm, and I worked in the industry, so I had an opportunity to work for Elanco, the Eli Lilly company. I worked for them for about 6 years. And then in my 20s, I founded two retail fertilizer companies, one in Alberta and one later on in Saskatchewan. So the Alberta company worked on the Alberta retail business that I was involved in, focused in on the traditional crops in Canada, wheat, barley, canola, oats, that sort of thing. And then in the Saskatchewan business, I was also involved with potatoes and chickpeas and lentils and pulse crops like peas. So it gave me a real good understanding of how all those crops, and it was really interesting for me to be able to witness and to experience firsthand the evolution of the farming practices that we had in the 80s and maybe even in the 70s, but in the 80s and through the 90s into the 2000s to today. And so I have very, very good perspective on watching how farmers adopted this technology and the differences it's made in agriculture, particularly in Western Canada, but all throughout Canada, corn, soybeans, and then now down in the United States with the crops that they're growing here. But also internationally, I've been able to see that progression happen. So it's been it's been very, very interesting to observe.
So in terms of how farmers plant, conventional versus GMO, and I'm bringing up the GMO because, as you know, in this film, we're looking at conversations regarding, in terms of the benefits or the advantage that you see for farmers to plant GMO versus conventional seeds. I'd love to hear what that is.
I'll start off by talking about canola, because it's a large crop in Canada, and virtually 90% of the canola crop is genetically modified. Canola was bred, it's a canola crop was bred specifically to improve the health aspects of that oil. So low glucosinolates and low uric acid made that oil much healthier from canola versus rapeseed. And so when I started my career, we saw that migration from rapeseed into canola, which is now spread throughout the world, that oil profile. And incidentally, just as an aside, it was the health food of the year. Forget about the year it was, but it was the United States health food of the year. I'd call it 5 to 7 years ago.
Well, who determined that?
Well,
there was industry behind that.
I'm sure there was.
Yeah.
But it was declared.
Well, let me ask you, was there a benefit in terms of the yield? Was there a benefit in terms of being cheaper to plant?
Practice.
Right, because I know that you consult, your field really is helping the farmer. So I'm assuming cost, keeping the costs down, better yields per cost, right? I mean, that would be.
I think some of the things that happened as a result of the technology and some of the advantages for farmers were that in the early part of my career, we used a lot of pesticides to grow canola, and a lot of them were soil incorporated pesticides. So we had a lot of tillage going on. I know that in the 70s and the 80s, we often tilled canola ground once in the fall, maybe twice, and then maybe 2 times in the spring before planting, all in an effort to adequately distribute pesticides in the soil that we would have sprayed on, or we would have planted that crop and then used multiple applications through the growing season. So as a result of having genetically modified or genetically engineered seed, the farmers have been able to significantly reduce the amount of tillage that they use to grow the crop. And so much so that many of the farmers today actually don't till at all. So they'll be able to seed that canola crop into standing stubble from the prior year and rely on the weed control benefits that come to them as a result of the GE technology. I think that's one of the most profound things that I've seen in terms of change in cultural practices. That lends itself to a whole bunch of benefits. I see a lot less soil erosion. I see a lot less degradation of organic matter. I see better water infiltration, better water percolation, less soil particulates or dust in the air, so there's an improvement there. I see better water use efficiency from the crop. And those are all kind of the environmental things. And then, of course, the ability of a farmer to be able to plant in a one-pass operation, or maybe 2 at the most, significantly increases his efficiency. So we're driving down the amount of diesel fuel we're burning, and quite frankly, the technology works really, really well. So the crops are clean, and we're not using as much pesticide to grow the crops. Not by a long shot. It's way down.
And that might be with certainly with canola. I'm not as familiar with the genetic modification of canola. It's not like Roundup Ready. It's not glyphosate ready, right? And it's not BT like corn.
No, it is absolutely.
It is BT.
But you've got several things too. I mean, you've got Roundup Ready canola.
Oh, you do. Okay.
And you've got Liberty Link canola, which is glyphosate. And so we've got rotation that happens with those 2 different herbicide groups. You've also got related technologies such as Clearfield canola, which is not a GM, but it is engineered to be resistant to a different herbicide group. Herbicide groups and herbicide rotations are very important. It doesn't matter whether you're an organic farmer or you're a conventional farmer or you're a GE farmer. That management of herbicide rotation is fairly critical. And the same would be said of soybeans and corn, is that it has allowed the farmers to dramatically reduce tillage in their operations.
But you had mentioned reducing the pesticide use, and I don't know if you're being very specific that pesticide is a pesticide or if you're looking at also herbicide. Because I know from 2008, 2009 studies, we're looking at over 8,000 studies from universities, from agricultural departments in the United States. The actual amount of Roundup having to be used on Roundup Ready soy increased by over 382 million pounds just for using genetically modified crops. They require so much more because they've become so resistant. So it's interesting that the canola, I mean, according to what you're saying, and I haven't looked at that data, but with canola that hasn't been the case. But with soy, the actual increased use of chemicals has increased because
Well,
it's not pesticide, but the herbicide use has gone way up.
Said, I don't have any problem with what you said, Tony, but you said that the increase of glyphosate went up. Makes sense. As they move towards more Roundup-ready crops, the use of glyphosate should go up because that's occupying a larger percentage. But if you look at the total amount of pesticide that's used, the total amount of pesticide used in corn production in the United States, there are also studies out there that total pesticides have gone down.
By 64 million.
Glyphosate has got up, but
Right.
total pesticides have gone down. The other side of that equation that I think is the untold side of the equation is that the toxicity of the products that we're no longer using, like atrazine, for example, is a tough product. There are a lot of insecticides, and correct, you're exactly right. I use the word pesticides, but we could go a little deeper in the discussion of herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides,
Right.
and we could delve into that. So I agree with you that the use of Roundup has gone up, and probably still continues. I don't know what the current stats are, but during that era when the introduction of GE crops came in, without a doubt, Roundup sales and Liberty sales went up because that was what farmers were moving towards, but they weren't using other products. I use those products. I use those other products, and I don't want to go back to using those other products again. What we're using today, handling-wise and safety-wise for the workers and the people that are doing the work, is way better than what we were using in the 70s and the 80s. I don't want to go back to those products.
Okay, so while what you're saying is true, and it is true, that pesticide use went down, and it went down in the first 13 years of introducing genetically modified soy by 64 million pounds. So that's huge. But,
can I ask?
and that's for the corn.
Because you referred to a study.
Right.
Which study did you refer to? Because as you know, there are many studies out there, some that will show you that pesticides use has gone up, others that will show you pesticide use has dramatically decreased, right?
So,
and a lot of them are computer extrapolated studies.
Right. Well, this is based on the NASS and USDA's data. So just based on their data alone, I've looked at a few meta-analyses, and there's one specifically by Benbrook. I'm sure you're familiar with Charles Benbrook's name. But if you actually do look at the data...
And Benbrook's study is widely debated.
I'm sure. But there are other people who've looked at the data. The data is the data. And it's not just here. It's also in Argentina. And it's some other countries. Argentina has put together their equivalent of the NASS.
Well, let's talk about Argentina. Let's get to there. But
okay, and I was about to get to there with the safety.
We'll get to Argentina in a bit. Okay.
But yes, the pesticides are very toxic, and they've been reduced. 64 million pounds in 13 years is a lot. But 382 million pounds of increased glyphosate is also a lot, and the safety has been challenged. You're talking about it's much safer for the workers, but I know in the Chaco region in Argentina, the local government did a study on what was coinciding with the increased use of glyphosate because of Roundup-ready crops. And what they found is that pediatric cancers went up threefold, and birth defects went up fourfold, and it was directly related to the increased use and it was for the workers, by the way. This is in the region where they're growing everything. So atrazine was bad, but it's certainly looking like workers, for people working around the glyphosate, a triple increase in pediatric tumors and cancers, and a quadruple increase in birth defects is also not probably a good health outcome.
I can't comment on that study specifically, but I do know the study. And I don't know the intricacies of the study. I also know that there are a lot of folks in the industry wondering, and a lot of people, scientists, et cetera, that are looking at studies like that and saying, well, how was it done? And I'm no PhD, and I'm not even going to speculate. Would the workers have been exposed to more toxic pesticides without GE? I think absolutely.
Well, remember, they were already planting, so they switched. So we're talking about they were being exposed
so
prior.
And then
when they switched, they started seeing this increase. And this was a governmental study looking at data. That's all it was.
So you want me to agree with...
No, you don't have to agree with me.
Because I can't comment on the study. I don't know it.
Okay. So I'm just bringing up the notion that while you look back and you said, oh, wow, atrazine was bad, now looking back at it, it could be possible for you 10 years from now to look back and say, wow, I didn't realize.
Geez, Tony, I don't know. If you look at atrazine, or you look at some of the compounds that we used to use to grow our crops, and I'll say this again, I don't want to go back to those compounds. And the reality is that, you know, Mother Nature is a ferocious opponent to growing food. She throws everything at us, and whether it's a disease or insects coming in, weed pressure, Mother Nature is a formidable opponent, and farmers out there need tools to be able to grow the crops that we have. So to go back to the technologies, and it seems like a lot of people want us to retract to the 60s, 70s technology. As a farmer and as a person who works with farmers, I don't want to see that happen. That to me is regression. We have a lot of real positive things going on. I don't want to go back to the technologies that we're using in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And to me, it's environmentally risky, environmentally harmful, and I don't think that it's particularly sustainable. I think that the technologies we have today are better. And I think that we'll learn more and more as we go along, too. I mean, the amount of information that we're digesting in society today, and the amount of data that we're processing in all aspects of genetics is petabytes of data almost on a weekly basis. So it's phenomenal the amount of information we're getting, and I think we're putting that to pretty good use.
So you mentioned sustainability, and I know from talking to and reading about reading plant pathologists and plant physiologists talk about the glyphosate, how it interferes specifically with magnesium and manganese uptake, and all other minerals. I mean, not just those minerals, not just the manganese, but all minerals are reduced, and there's increased plant pathology with these new genetic modifications. In fact, some of the crop deficiencies seen in the genetic modified soy has been attributed, half at least, has been attributed to something called splitting, the soy splitting. And they think, and what has been thought is that it's part of the genetic modification process, the transformational process in the lab with the genes.
Well, there's a couple of things going on in what you just said there. One is that what you have to, the manganese issue is something that all farmers need to pay closer attention to. Manganese is part of a suite of micronutrients in soils, and so micronutrient deficiency globally is a very, very serious problem. Zinc deficiency, iodine, iron deficiency. Zinc deficiency is such an issue that when a pregnant woman has a zinc deficiency, the child is born with less mental capacity. You can't correct it. These micronutrients in soils, and this is interesting because I actually spent about 6 years working in the area of micronutrients. So these micronutrients in soils are declining over time. And the mechanism you're referring to is the shikimate pathway inside the plants. Does glyphosate affect the shikimate pathway? It may have an impact on manganese. It may. There are people that says that it does. There are people that says it may not have as big an impact as others purport. However, regardless of that, whether you have conventional or whether you have GE soybeans, my observation, Tony, in the field, conventional soybeans or Roundup Ready or any of the GE soybeans, is that we are seeing more manganese deficiencies in soybeans. We're seeing more manganese deficiencies because we're seeing more manganese deficient soils. So if you track oats, for example, and oats is a high manganese using crop, it will exhibit very cleanly. It exhibits manganese deficiencies in its physiology. We can see that in soybeans as well. So is there an issue with manganese in soybeans? I think there is. Is it correlated to glyphosate use? Maybe. I'm not a scientist, but it may be. What can we do about it? Well, I think that what we should be doing about it is what we've been doing with our farm customers is addressing those deficiencies in the soil. And I can tell you that in Canada, for example, parent material is low in copper. So a lot of the wheat that we grow has been declining in copper levels in the wheat. And so you could say, is that the wheat's problem? No, the soil over time needs to be replenished. We're seeing the same thing in zinc, And we're seeing the same thing in manganese and calcareous soils. We can see the same thing in iron. So is there something there? Yep, I think there might be something there. Is it related specifically to Roundup and the shikimate pathway and interference? Maybe, maybe not. Are we seeing more manganese deficiencies in soybeans? Yes. We're seeing that, though, in conventional and Roundup-ready soybeans. And
we're not seeing it in organic. And we're seeing it more. It is because, so all these soil deficiencies.
Where would your organic soybeans get the manganese from?
So wait, let me explain.
Okay.
All organic where they're grown not in monocrop. So what we see is soil deficiencies are increased in monocrop culture. So that doesn't relate to the genetic modification issue. It relates to how large farms grow.
Well, that spills over into, that spills over into another area of discussion, and a valid one. I mean, we're sitting today in Iowa, and this is corn and soybean country. I mean, that's what this is.
Yeah.
And it's blessed. It's blessed. You know, Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois produce more corn than almost the entire southern hemisphere of the world. The three I's are big. And the reason they do this is because they can. They do this because they can. They grow corn and soybeans, and people call it monoculture, but they do it because most parts of the world can't. And they do it here because it's economically viable, and it's what the farmers can do here. In Canada, we have a little bit more diversity, but we can't grow as much corn and soybeans because we can't. So we grow canola and wheat and barley and rotate with some other crops. So you would argue, or you would say that our cropping patterns are better because we have more rotational crops. I wouldn't argue against that. At the same time, these guys know how to grow corn and soybeans, and they feed the world with corn and soybeans.
Well, that's interesting that you said they feed the world, because most of this is feed corn and a lot of feed soy, and third world countries really can't afford meat, and they don't use meat for their protein. So I'm wondering how you say they feed the world. That's, if you could explain to me, because that's very confusing for me.
Well, the reality is that the North American population likes its protein as meat, right? So this area, the corn and soybeans that are grown go into feed. They also go, by the way, from Brazil and Argentina into the European Economic Community for the same purpose. So, and by doing that, we're not pulling feed and food from other areas of the world backwards. So we're feeding this area. Do you follow?
Kind of. This area is not starving.
No,
so
of course not. It's not starving because 2% of the population feeds 98% of the population because of the ability to grow the corn and soybeans to feed the livestock that we enjoy. So we are, when I say feeding the world, North America is part of that world. And so it's significant.
Fair enough. But what I would say is that, and maybe it's not you. I've looked at your site and I've read some of your blog, and I thought that I saw that your take on GM crops is that it helps feed the world, feeds poor people and starving people.
Well, I think it could.
Because it doesn't. You do admit that it's not right now. It's not there's no nutrition that's getting to.
One of the reasons I wanted to be here was to talk about that. So there's a couple of points that, and I know this will be cut, but there's a couple of points that I do want to cover with you. I want to cover Argentina and Brazil, because I want to talk about that. And then I'm going to get right now into Kenya, for example, okay? So Tony, there's a couple of points I want to make about that, and this is really the reason I'm here today. The reason I'm here today is because I believe that as opposed to many of the previous breeding methods that we've employed in agriculture, RNAi technology or transgenic technology, both those RNA has gene switching and transgenic, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but those technologies are so much more exact than what we've been living with. And they offer us the opportunity to genetically modify crops to be more salt resistant, to be more water use efficient, to have higher nutrient density. So when I talk about feeding the world with genetically modified crops or using that technology to help feed the world, I'm very serious about that. I just got back from Kenya. I went to Kenya and I was working on a project with 14 schools, orphanages, and clinics. And every one of them has gardens, and we're trying to help them grow these gardens. While I was in Kenya, I talked to some doctors there about the most serious nutritional deficiencies in Kenya, and it was caloric intake. They simply didn't have enough calories. The second thing was vitamin A deficiency was very rampant and a serious problem. And then came iodine and zinc was a big issue in Kenya. And so I've had the opportunity, the good fortune to be able to travel through a lot of biotech laboratories and see a lot of work that's been done. So the Danforth Center in St. Louis has developed a cassava crop that is resistant to a virus. The cassava is tapioca for us in North America, but it is a root crop and grown in the soil, and it can stay in the soil for up to 18 months, so you can harvest it when you're hungry and eat it. And this virus decimates that crop, absolutely decimates the crop. The Danforth Center has done a lot of work on this, and it's this research work is supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it's very, very effective. It sits on the shelf in Kenya because the Kenya government right now is paralyzed over the GM debate. So it sits there. So there's a technology that could help feed the poorest people on the planet, and it sits there. And another one, whether I bring it up or you bring it up, will be golden rice. And I think there's people on both sides of the fence of that, but the reality is that technology has sat on the table since 2002. And a genetically modified rice, fortified in beta-carotene, allowing people who eat it to have higher levels of vitamin A, I think that helps some of the poorest people on the planet. And my concern about the railing against genetic engineering in North America is that we, and I'm saying the fat we of the world, are potentially hurting some of the poorest people on the planet. And I could go on with other advances in genetic engineering that have nothing to do with Monsanto, that have made a difference in food quality historically. We could talk about papaya, for example.
Well, let me ask you about the rice.
Yeah.
It's a great example. Because in order to get your daily requirement, which is not a lot, you have to eat 14 bowls of that rice. And so 14 bowls of rice is a lot of empty carbohydrate, which is actually not good for anyone. Well, so that's why it hasn't really panned out. I mean, it
hasn't panned out because it hasn't made it to market. And the studies that I have seen said that golden rice, eaten in regular daily quantities, will make a difference to vitamin A levels inside human beings. That's what I've read in studies I've looked at.
Well, to get your normal daily requirement for an average adult.
So should we not?
14 bowls are a lot. That's not.
So 1 or 2 bowls, 1 bowl would give them something, as opposed to nothing.
But at what price? I mean, so
what is the price?
Well, I don't know.
The price is free. They've already said that the golden rice will be given free.
The first year?
No, free to the poorest farmers on the planet. Free.
Indefinitely, every year. They free seeds every year.
That's what the agreements is. Those are the agreements that I have seen. That's what I've read.
And do we know what the health outcome is? So my question is this. You know,
I know what the health outcome of vitamin A deficiency is.
I do too. Yeah, I'm a physician.
I know.
But I also know what the health outcome is of having endocrine disruptors in your system, of having the shikimate pathway of the bacteria that's in your biome.
But now you're tying glyphosate in with the vitamin A.
But what I'm saying is we don't really know what the long-term use on mammals is. And so without knowing, it's kind of...
Long-term use of what? Of glyphosate or golden rice?
Golden rice. Because there's genetic modification. So with every genetic modification we've seen, like with Roundup Ready, there's more glyphosate used, and we also have...
So how do we then advance the science of plant breeding? What are the alternatives? If you don't like genetic engineering and transgenics, you don't like RNAi, then what is the alternative for us to use?
Well, you're implying that we have to do plant genetic science. What I'm saying is sustainable farming and helping subsistence farmers is probably, this is probably more of a political issue really than a scientific issue. Because if you look at subsistence farmers in countries like India and in Brazil, where there's been genetic modification crops brought in, it hasn't decreased poverty. It's actually increased poverty, increased suicide of these farmers. It hasn't. It's been there's been a political.
So this is where
it's been a political issue. So
right.
there might be. I'm not saying there's not some valid genetic modification. There certainly could be, but so far, it hasn't panned out the way the industry says it would. We don't see poor third world nations being fed nutritionally because of genetic modified plants being grown anywhere. It's mostly soy and corn. In terms of numbers, it's cotton, canola, soy, corn. Those are the bigger numbers.
Those are the only ones that have made it to the market in substantial quantities. And I agree with you that you're pointing out kind of the obvious. But to get a crop that is genetically engineered to market today will take 13 years and over $136 million. There are, 165 genetically engineered events. That's what they call them. 165 genetically engineered crops approved in the United States today. That's how many there are. The cost of getting one of these things through the regulatory process here is so onerous that only companies that have got significant resources can get there. So consequently, they're concentrating on the biggest crops in the world, which are corn, cotton, right? So some of the crops that we really need help in, some of the crops that would feed the poorest people in the world, and some of the crops that would benefit the most from genetic engineering aren't being given a chance. There are four main streams of crop propagation today. We have conventional breeding, so you grow your crops in the field and you cross-pollinate, and this is conventional breeding. And you're trying to cause nature to smash together genes from one variety and another variety. You're trying to smash these genes together, and you do that through conventional breeding methods, through pollination and so on and so forth. And you may disrupt, or you may introduce 30,000, 100,000 different gene disruptions as you seek out the mutation, which is what it is. You seek out a mutation in that crop, ultimately, that you want to take as a new variety forward. That's conventional crop breeding. And by and large, most crops are still propagated that way, and it's going on all the time. It's all the time. There's not a crop that we eat today that hasn't been manipulated by man. That's sure. That's just the fact. The other one that people don't understand is mutagenesis. Now there are close to 3,000 organic crops that owe their genesis to mutagenesis. Mutagenesis is the bombardment of seeds with nuclear radiation or the submersion of seeds in carcinogenic chemicals. And I'm really serious about this. This is what the industry has been doing, and it's on the rise again. This type of breeding is on the rise again. And you contrast that to RNAi technology, which is the flipping of 3 or 4 genes, or usually 1 to 3 genes, that exist inside of the plant, and you flip them around, such as polyphenolic oxidase enzymes in the Arctic apple. Or transgenic, where you take 3 or 4 genes that have a trait. And a good example of this one, and this would actually dovetail in both the questions you've asked, wild potato has been found that's resistant to potato blight. So they can isolate the genes inside the wild potato and splice it into conventional potato, and have conventional potato varieties that have all the attributes that we're comfortable with, but are also resistant to the blight. Because it's genetically engineered, that has not made it to market. Instead, what we're doing to fight the blight at field level, and this is again why I'm here today, is we're spraying between 6 and 16 applications of fungicide on potatoes. Now, I don't know about you, but I do know about me, but I would rather take the genes out of wild potato and splice them into conventional potatoes that will be resistant to the potato blight. And the irony is, it was done by Irish scientists. So,
well, I agree with you on that one.
So that's
not taking a gene from an insect or something from a foreign kingdom. of the plant. You're taking a gene from the potato itself, from the a Solanaceae plant, to another Solanaceae.
Exactly.
So that, I don't think many
But
people...
a lot of people have, like if you go to the memes that are on Facebook, or the memes that are on Pinterest or Google, and you look at it, they talk about the splicing of fish into tomatoes, and there's all these different things. That hasn't happened. I mean, the reality is most transgenic work has been between the same species, right?
Well, the BT corn, you're saying that was...
BT corn is a great example of a technology that was, like, that's a, Bacillus thuringiensis, right?
So that's a bacterium.
Right, it's a bacteria that's been put inside. So organic farmers use BT extensively. They use it all the time. It's a pesticide that's used in organic farming. And they use it all the time, and that's what they're using. And so that BT is now inside of the corn and inside of the soybean now in Brazil. Mm-hmm. Intacta is the first year that they're growing Intacta commercially in Brazil. That having that BT inside of the plant reduces the amount of insecticide applications that the farmers have to use dramatically. I was just on a farm in Brazil in March of this year, and they said the Intacta will knock down their insecticide applications 4 to 6%. So I'd like to do toxicology studies on those workers and find out what the benefits are.
I would too.
Yeah.
But one of my questions to you would be this. In terms of approval as for safety, the safety studies, the FDA has decided that there's really no difference between genetic modification and non-genetically modified seeds and plants. And so therefore, the safety, the long-term safety is really, they just got approval because they're being assumed, it's assumed that there's no difference.
No, that's not accurate.
That's not accurate?
No, it isn't accurate. Right now, if you look at the approval of conventional crops or mutagenesis generated crops, neither one of those has to go through an FDA approval process. You don't know how many genes were switched. You don't know what the long-term, like if you're talking long-term, there's no such thing as being 100% sure of anything, right? That's the nature of science. You're never 100% sure. But if you're questioning the long-term effects of a breeding program, and you say, well, we're not sure of the long-term effects, I would be much more afraid of the long-term effects of mutagenesis breeding than I would be of RNAi or transgenic breeding. And I've looked at this quite a bit, and those two breeding methods, conventional and transgenic, do not have to go through FDA approval. Now, people will say, well, the FDA approval process is voluntary. Technically, it's voluntary, but no seed that is genetically engineered has made it to the market, will make it to the marketplace without FDA approval, and then it's got to go through the USDA. So just for me to finish the statement, it's conventional crops, mutagenous crops, are not treated the same way as RNAi or transgenic crops. Those ones have to go through a regulatory process. Those ones have to go through approval processes. They have to have studies that are generated to have them approved. So the FDA is very careful in terms of the approval process, and same thing with CFIA in Canada. But these other crops that are bred, and they come on the market, have you ever, like, if anybody picks up a gardening journal and just whips it open, you have all of these crops that are just coming on all the time. These new varieties of tomatoes, these new varieties of lettuce, these new varieties of potatoes. Where do they come from? They come from
hybridization, right?
Well, conventional breeding, that would fall into there, yeah. But they come from a process that doesn't require regulation. And yet, we have a regulatory process under which the GE crops must fall, and people are saying, well, we want more. Well, let's put all the crops underneath the same study.
The difference is...
you never prove anything is safe then. You couldn't.
The difference is a hybridization, let's say, nectarine. I mean, hybridization of fruit happens, or vegetables, or any plant, happen outside of a laboratory. They can happen haphazardly, right? cross-pollination. They can, right? They can.
Yeah, I
and
agree
they
with
do.
you. They can. Yeah.
The difference is when you take something into a laboratory and now you're taking genes from a bacterium or a virus or another species of some sort. You're translocating the genes, you're splitting genes. You might be affecting the shikimate pathway. You might be affecting other pathways that actually affect mammals and the person eating them. So it's different than just a hybridization where it was a cross-pollination.
Well,
that's been going on for millennia.
Well, you say it's different, I say it's not, because the mashing together of what's going on in the field by researchers plowing together, like I just read something about plums and apricots, plums and...
a pluot.
Yeah, that's not natural. That is not a natural fruit. But are plums a natural fruit? Like, where did they come from? So you got this, what was it called?
Pluot.
Pluot. Okay, so you got this pluot. What are the long-term implications of that? And how is that different? And how is that somehow better than taking a tomato and increasing the antioxidants in a tomato through bioengineering, where you're dealing with 1 to 4 genes, and here you're dealing with an unknown number of potentially hundreds of thousands of genes that have been mashed together. You don't know the long-term effect of that. I would argue that you probably know more about the long-term effect of transgenics than you do about some of these mutagenetics.
How would you?
Well, at least you have a handle on the trait that was affected.
But how would you know the long-term effect, especially if they're just put out in the market and
you wouldn't have any more or less confidence in the long-term effect of a mutagenesis-generated seed than you would have from a genetically engineered seed. I mean, you wouldn't have any more or less confidence in long-term benefits or long-term risk. You couldn't.
Okay, so
you can't measure the long-term.
Okay, but I thought you had said you would have more knowledge of long-term effects of the genetic
I would be more confident in the long-term effects. I'd be more confident, maybe not in the long-term effects. I'd be more confident in the process that we have generated today. And again, I think that's the reason that I'm here, is that I feel so strongly that technology and science is moving forward, that I worry that the railing against Monsanto, whether people believe there's a conspiracy theory, you talked about the suicides in India. Well, I'm carrying documentation with me right now that shows that the BT cotton has resulted in farmers using vastly less pesticide to grow Indian cotton. The amount of money they're making is 50% higher. The amount of pesticide they're spraying on, and keep in mind that it's tropical, so there's a lot of bugs there. So they're spraying all of the time. So the toxicology load is less. And this whole thing about Indian farmers and suicide, when you look at long-term Indian farmers, the levels haven't changed, and farm-level suicides in India are lower than urban-level suicides, and there is no correlation between that and genetically engineered foods.
That's a good point. A lot of those farmers migrated to the urban environment when the genetic modification plants, the GE plants,
because they could.
Because they couldn't afford to grow.
No, because they could, because they're making more money off the crop they're growing. Their kids could move to cities. There's another side to the story, and that's what I'm here talking about. There's another side. When a farmer is all of a sudden making more money and the technology works, he doesn't have to rely so much on physical labor. His kids can actually do something different, which is what we're blessed with in North America. Can I, yeah. So,
I was just going to say the inner city, or the poverty rates went up with these migrated farmers. So, there's been studies.
Again,
right, it's hard to know.
The middle class, though, in India,
well, the middle class has grown phenomenally.
Phenomenally. So,
but I wouldn't say that's because of genetic modification.
No, I think that's a reach for all of us. Yeah, but cotton is a good example of a crop to discuss because it's grown in the United States. And I reached out to one of our PhDs, and I said to Will, Will, tell me about the evolution of cotton in the Mississippi Delta. Tell me about the pesticide use in cotton, and talk to me about before GE cotton and after. And he said that conventionally grown cotton, even today, if you're growing conventionally grown cotton, to fight the boll weevil, to fight the caterpillars, to fight the bugs and the weeds and the disease. You're going to be using between, he said between 24 and 26 pounds of active ingredient. So active ingredient being pesticide, active ingredient. The amount that they're using now to produce cotton, using genetic engineered cotton seeds, is less than 4 pounds of active ingredient. So there's a really interesting discussion point for a trade-off. Do you want to go back? And some people are saying that they have to have, they have to have non-GE cotton. Do they understand what the pesticide load is on the environment and the cotton plant with non-GE versus GE? So what are the long-term risks? So there's BT and Roundup Ready inside of the cotton. Mm-hmm. So you can spray it, so you can plant the crop and its resistance against the bugs, and you can clean up the weeds. And I'll get into herbicide resistance.
Right, I was just going to say,
yeah.
It sounds like there's a whole lot of glyphosate being sprayed
there is.
And
that comes with its own set of challenges too, so we'll get to that. I'd much rather have a cotton plant that fights the insects with BT technology and can be sprayed with Roundup, which is far less, has a far lower toxicity index than the previous herbicides they were using, than go back to the way that it was. Now, I know you're going to ask about herbicide resistance and weeds, and it is a very serious problem, and farmers know it. The problem is the technology has worked so good that we've been able to plant our corn, spray tice, and go to the lake, and it's worked really, really well. The problem with that is that in any regime, and I mentioned before that organic farmers that use pesticides, because there are many pesticides sanctioned for use in organic farming, and some of them, like the organic pyrethroids, are very, very dangerous to humans and to bees. And if you don't believe me, just look at what's called pygranic, which is an organically derived pyrethroid, and it's used to kill insects in organic production. But if you overuse that in an organic growing regime, or you are a conventional grower using conventional herbicides, whatever that means, or you're a genetically engineered grower using Roundup Ready or Liberty seed, and you overuse whatever compounds you're going to use, you build up resistance, and weeds start to become resistant. And that is, you and I we would have no disagreement there. That is a serious issue. It's so serious right now that farmers all over North America are really being challenged to do herbicide rotations right now. So we have to be able to rotate. And that may mean some farmers have to pull back from Roundup Ready and plant conventionals, which means that they're going to go to alternate herbicide regimes.
Which does seem to be what's happening.
To get the weeds, yeah.
Because the sales of conventional seeds have gone up over the last few years.
And
it does seem to be that's what's
not
happening.
entirely surprising. And I think that the sale of conventional seeds is going up for two reasons. One of them is that farmers are catching on that they do need to do rotational rotations of chemical groups on their farms. And it's something we track. It's very important. And the second thing is that I think some people are tapping into what's rising as the non-GMO market. So I think some farmers are consciously going back to older varieties or conventional varieties to tap into a movement that this film is helping to create.
So what I've been reading is that farmers who have been growing GMO Roundup Ready soy have started reducing their Roundup Ready soy and increasing their the planting of conventional. And this has been a big trend over the last year or two.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that statement. I don't know if the word big trend is the right word to, but it is starting to happen. I mean, the reality is I think we were up to 93% genetically engineered soybean planted in the United States of America. I could be right, but 90 for sure. And so when you get that much going on, and it's all moved towards one herbicide, which is primarily glyphosate. But again, this is really interesting because the only company people seem to understand when they mention genetic engineering is Monsanto. Monsanto, a $13.4 billion company, but the organic movement, Whole Foods and these companies are $20 billion too, right? So they're the only ones that get talked about. But the reality is that, all of the large companies are working on technologies that is genetically engineered technology, and we're starting to see some differences happening in genetic engineered crops that hopefully will hit the marketplace and allow farmers to plant soybeans with different genetically engineered herbicides in the rotation. So different herbicide regimes because of the different genetic engineering breeding. But in the short term, right now, what you're saying is true. If we have to get a handle on a resistant weed, be it ragweed or something like that, that's got away on us on our farm, then we've got to move into a different variety and treat it with different chemicals. There's only one way out, and that is you have to kill the weeds, because if the weeds take over the crop, you don't have a crop. And this is, when people in the city look at these fields, I don't know that they have an understanding of the risk level that these guys are taking. Like, a potato grower will dump $2,500 to $4,000 an acre into the ground, right, to grow potatoes. A canola grower will fork out $500-600 an acre. And corn growers, $1,200-1,500 more an acre. A lot of money going into the ground to have it at risk from disease, weeds, or insects. And so the industry, and I just saw a stat the other day that if we wiped out all pesticides that farmers use on the planet, we would decrease food production 73% on the planet. That's what it would. That's how hard it would hit us. So, do we have issues?
Because
yes.
of the way we're growing. If we were growing, monoculture, of course, you have to use pesticides with monoculture. In large,
yes,
right? I mean,
yes.
you agree with that? That
yeah.
if we were growing.
But what would you tell a farmer outside of Cedar Rapids? What would you tell them to do? What would be the answer? They grow corn and soybeans. They grow it very successfully, and they grow it economically, and I would argue they grow it sustainably, because no farmer wakes up in the morning and is going to degrade his soil for future generations. It doesn't make sense. People who say that should spend some time with some farmers. But the reality is, what would these farmers grow? What would the farmer around Cedar Rapids grow if he wasn't growing corn and soybeans? What is the economically viable crop? What would we have them do?
That begs to talk about the politics again, because if corn and soy, if certain foods weren't subsidized heavily, there would be, and if other foods that were much more nutritious were subsidized, then they would be growing other things. They would be growing cruciferous vegetables to a larger degree. They'd be growing other things that had more nutrition than just carbohydrates.
I think there's merit in that. The reality is, California is so litigious, and the regulations in California are so strong with respect to pesticide applications and how the farmers grow, and then now they have water issues as well, that a lot of that production shifted over into Mexico, where they spray on whatever you want and bring it back in and consume it in California. In Canada, the organic market, 70% of organic produce comes from somewhere else. So there's what are their standards? So we don't know. So do I believe, and this is another thing that's happened in this whole discussion, is the polarization that has never ever existed in agriculture has now happened. There is a polarization between the local grower that's growing for the farmers markets and the local, and say that guy's an organic grower. He's never been vehemently opposed to commercial growers, and commercial growers have never been vehemently opposed to the local grower that's serving a local marketplace. But there is a significant polarization happening in agriculture today, and it's sad, and it's socially ripping the fabric out of small towns, because you got commercial growers that are getting bigger all the time. That's economies of scale. That's not going to decline. And then you got these local people, and the local people say, they're selling into a farmer's market and say, well, I'm organic. I don't use any pesticides, not like that guy out of town, right? The guy out of town says, well, yeah, but I'm not growing, I'm not selling my tomatoes for such and such a margin that can support. And quite frankly, if I did grow tomatoes on that scale, I would put you out of business and the price of tomatoes would not sustain the organic marketplace. The thing that bothers me most, Tony, about this whole discussion is when did the organic movement become the anti-GMO movement? When did that happen? And why did it happen? The organic movement started, and by the way, it's a label. It's a marketing label. It's not verified by the FDA or anything. I mean, there are some forms and stuff that the growers are supposed to fill out and keep track of, but by and large,
it's a little more than that.
Yeah, yes, there is, and I'm not against organic growers. I respect what they do. In fact, we learn a lot from them because the organic movement started with growers and consumers saying we want less synthetic pesticide and less synthetic fertilizer used on our food. That's where it started, and now it's become the anti-GMO movement. To me, and I'm going to write on this. Actually. I want to write this. And I think the future of feeding the world is GMO, genetically modified organic food production. Because if you took what I said earlier about us learning more and more about science all the time, and I know this documentary has been severely railing on glyphosate and Monsanto, but if you take genetic engineering and apply genetic engineering to crop protection so that the crops fight fungal diseases and viruses better, and if you apply genetic engineering so that the crops will fight insects better, and you apply genetic engineering so the crops can extract more nutrients out of the soil, whether it's extraction of phosphate or micronutrients such as zinc or iron or manganese, then you would have a crop that would be healthier because you've got more nutrition packed into it, and it would achieve the goal of using less synthetic pesticides and less synthetic fertilizers. So I don't know the answer to this, but I don't know why the organic movement has become the anti-GMO movement. And this is, at the heart of it, what's causing the fabric of many agricultural growers to be torn apart, because they used to live in harmony. Mm-hmm. And today, they're not living so much in harmony.
Well, I have a few ideas.
All right.
Okay. There's a list.
Okay.
One is the labeling issue, that a lot of people prefer to buy non-GMO. A lot of people don't want GMO. They don't want to be part of an experiment. And so the only way to be assured you're not buying GMO, for the most part, is buying organic. Well, there's a movement against labeling on the part of the industry because they, of course, rightly so, they want to sell more product. So that they created that battle right there. That's one thing. The other thing is that you had organic farmers living side by side with non-organic farmers, but then you had cases, and I think the first one was in Canada, where an organic farmer's crop was naturally pollinated, but with genetic material from his neighbor's farm, which was genetically modified crops. And suddenly he's got a legal battle with whoever the seed producer is.
Well,
and then there's one more. I'm not done.
2 points. Okay.
I'm not done.
I'm trying to keep track of the points.
Okay. The other one is the larger political question, which is, like in humans and in animals, if you live a certain way, you're going to be more prone to disease. And if you talk to plant physiologists and plant pathologists, and if you look at blights and you look at fungal infections and plants that are grown on sustainably oriented farms, meaning there's crop rotation, it's not monoculture, there's more resistance to disease, right? There's more resistance. We see less resistance as we start growing monoculturally, as we start using more chemicals. They do one thing, but then they bring up another. It's kind of like people who take a lot of antibiotics for their sore throats. It ruins their bioflora, and their immunity actually down the road is being weakened, right? Because they're more prone to infection. We know that from studies. In the moment, it helps, right? In the moment, but really what they should be doing is altering the way they're living to reduce the infection instead of taking antibiotics, right?
Yes.
So, and I know you have strong feelings on how people eat, and I get that. But so there are reasons why there has been now this separation, and really that they're at odds now, the organic growers with the GMO growers, and the reasons are real. And again, I'm going to recap. It's that there's been organic farmers who've been burned because their organic farms were infiltrated by genetic modified seeds, and now they're
So
that's one issue.
I'm going to be able to talk to that specifically
Okay.
because I have intimate knowledge of that case. And so you have
Right,
two
and
more
then right, and
yeah.
the other one, like I said, is the labeling. People prefer to buy organic. They prefer to buy non-genetically modified crops. The reason they're buying organic is because that's the one label they know.
So let's talk through that. Let's deal with the first thing that you brought up that is absolutely false. That farmer, who I could name, but I won't. We know that farmer.
Well, there's been more than one case now.
Okay,
There's been multiple
but that's
cases.
the one that you referred to first
Right,
of all.
the Canadian
Okay,
one.
Right. That was 800 acres sown in straight rows. And when they saw him spraying the crop with Roundup, they asked, where did you get the seed? Because you didn't buy the seed and you didn't pay a technology use agreement. And he said it blew in. Well, if you're an organic farmer, so this is the first thing that is always brought up about this case, that they say that guy was an organic farmer. Absolutely not true. Was not an organic farmer. There wasn't a small little plot of canola. It was 800 acres planted in straight rows that blew in from the road. And lastly, if you're an organic farmer, what are you doing spraying Roundup on the crop in the first place? Because that is way off label, right? So that case gained him notoriety around the world. And people have grabbed that case and ran with that case all around the world, and it is patently false. Those facts are true, I said. And the fact that he was an organic farmer pursued by Monsanto he was pursued by Monsanto, and rightly so. His neighbors are paying for the technology use agreement, and he wasn't. And he was found guilty. But in the meantime, this guy went all around the world speaking on the evils of a corporation. And you know what? Plant breeder rights are important. Whether you're Monsanto or whether you're a breeder that's working on conventional methods and it's taken you 50 years to perfect something, those breeder rights are important. So I just wanted to clear the air with that, because that is a sensational story that gets circulated just like the suicides in India get circulated. And it's not based in fact. So that's that one. Labeling. Let's talk about labeling. So labeling is interesting because under the FDA, again, I'm Canadian, so I've done a lot of reading on this. Americans would have more knowledge. CFIA in Canada, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, has similar requirement. But in the United States, the labeling of food is designed from a health standpoint, a health and safety standpoint. So if there's a difference in the composition of the food, say that you took and brought peanuts genes and put it into a tomato, you could have an allergen there. Now, nobody's done that, but that would have to be labeled because potentially there's a health risk there. If I give you the complex of sugar from an organic sugar beet, a conventionally grown sugar beet, and from a GMO sugar beet, and I gave you sugar, you can't tell the difference. There is no difference. So the labeling issue is and needs to stay with the health issue. There's a label on cigarette packages because cigarettes, now we discovered, kill you.
I think we always knew that.
Yeah,
I think that was
sure.
industry.
But
hidden.
the label is there because it's a health issue. There is no substantiated, none. 3 trillion meals served. There's not been one documented case of anybody dying from GMO food.
Well, how would you trace that exactly? I mean, there's in vitro work, right? So in vitro, and looking at also statistical analysis, we know that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor.
Now, are you talking in vitro or in vivo?
Well, I'm talking now in vitro. I'm talking about even in vitro. So
Okay.
if you look at cells, we know that cells die given a certain amount of glyphosate directly to the cells, right? We know that from laboratory studies.
Well, they'll die with salt too.
Yes, they will.
And they'll die quicker with salt.
Well,
and
it
they'll
depends
die
on the
quicker with
salinity.
nicotine, and they'll die quicker with
It
aspirin.
depends
right?
on the salinity.
Right.
But we know the amphibian studies with glyphosate causes a lot of birth defects, right?
I just went over the toxicology reports on glyphosate because I knew this was going to be brought up, and there I went over the LD50s, and I also went over the NOLA tests on toxicology. there is a difference between in vitro and in vitro. In vitro, you have a petri dish,
Right.
and you expose the cells to the carcinogenic chemical, or whatever the chemical would be, and that is one way of doing research work. A lot of people report that as being an accurate way of doing research work, when in fact that may not represent what's actually happening in nature.
I agree. I agree.
So the current issue with neonics and bee studies right now, and Canada is a good example because we have canola, and the canola is vast, millions of acres, and that supports the bees, and neonics are used inside canola production. But the levels inside of bees in the wild, 5 nanograms, I think it is, that they're finding, 3 to 5 nanograms, if that. But you go to an in vitro study, and the levels are 6-8 times higher than they're finding in nature. So is that representative?
No,
So,
but the studies on the bees themselves, not the in vitro, and their mitochondria. I mean, the studies on what the neonics do to the mitochondria are real. I mean, there are centers that are, like Purdue is one of the centers,
Again,
Harvard is
but-
one of the
but you
centers.
don't
They're
get-
actually looking at the direct effect of neonics on the bees' mitochondria.
well, no question about that. I mean, that and tied to the, we're really off topic here, but tied to the...
Well, it's related because
Sure.
neonics are used on GMO.
They're used in all crops.
Right,
So
but they're used.
they'd be used in all crops. So the idea there is like, is an in vitro study representative of what's going on in
No.
nature? And I just read an excellent case study on this that looked at the amount of neonic exposure that a bee would have in a canola field, for example, versus an in vitro study. And you can't extrapolate that in vitro study into nature.
Well, I'm agreeing with that.
Yeah,
That I'm agreeing with.
And
but
so, but it catches a lot of press.
Oh, sure. But I'm talking about the actual studies on the
So
bees
back to
themselves.
glyphosate,
Yeah, back to glyphosate. 'Cause
and you brought in vitro into it, right? So in vitro studies. Now, is there a correlation between in vitro?
Well, let's get off the in vitro then. Let's
Okay.
talk about the fact that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor, and that the use of glyphosate is associated with all kinds of issues. I mean, I don't know what you're going to say about Seralini's study, and Seralini is just one of the people who studied
But
tumor
you're
growth.
not going to throw Seralini into this film. I mean, even
Okay, then we'll leave Seralini. Let's leave Seralini alone.
Even his pictures that he documented. I mean, so much is questionable about that, and I'm not even talking about the methodology, the fact that his pictures left out the control. And the fact that his book and his movie came out at the same time, and the fact that he got reporters to sign a non-disclosure so they couldn't talk about the methodology before he released the study, all of that brings into question. And then the scientific community basically looked at his methodology in terms of testing and the number of rats that first of all, the type of rat is prone to tumors, and then what do you have?
Wasn't it the same type of rat?
All of them were.
Okay, let's move on. He's not going to cover it.
Where to
Well,
next?
I think what really to recap what we're discussing is that people want to know what they're eating, and I think people have a right to know if something has been genetically modified. I think people have a right to know that. There's no accountability or traceability if there is a problem if things aren't labeled. And since we don't have long-term studies we don't even have long-term studies. So the studies that we do have, that the FDA has seen, has been from the industry itself.
That's not true. There are many.
There's no long-term health studies.
Well,
though. It's impossible to do it.
As long term as we've had genetically engineered crops in the marketplace, there have been people looking at their effects. So I don't know what long term constitutes, but there's 5 and 10 year studies that have been done independently of industry.
So are you telling me that there's been studies looking at the health effects of a population that eats genetically modified food compared to a population that doesn't eat genetically modified food?
No, I'm not going to say that at all, because this is an area where I'm starting to cross into an area where I really don't have the expertise. So I'm not going to comment on that.
Because that study hasn't been done, I can tell you.
Well, you know what? I'm sitting on data right now that's got like hundreds and hundreds of metadata studies. So we choose to disagree on that point. But I don't know that I'm not going to agree with you on that, because I don't agree with you on that. It's just that I can't substantiate my side of the argument because I don't have the knowledge.
So you're saying there's been studies looking at populations that are eating non-genetically modified food and comparing their disease rates to populations eating genetically modified food?
No, I don't know that.
Yeah, those studies have not been done,
Yeah,
I can assure you.
Yeah. So back to the label discussion then. So the FDA will put health risks on labels. By the way, I think one of the most important things that we should be labeling in food is nutritional density. By the way, credit to Whole Foods. They got that ANDI index, which is the average nutrient index.
Yeah, it's
I think
good.
that's good.
It is
I think
good.
that's a good. I was looking at the ANDI index in their food in their store, and they have like Soda Pop's got a 0, and 100 is kale, right? It's got 100 ANDI index. I don't like kale, but anyways, it's good to know that that kind of exists, and I think that's where food labeling should go. To argue that you need to label a GE crop, there is no scientific evidence that says that GE crops are a health risk. Their constitution inside of food is identical, as I outlined with sugar. And
well, sugar is a poor example. What about the chemical residue? Do you think that that should be listed?
Okay, well, so the chemical residue, now if you're talking about that, we should list the chemical residue for all crops grown.
Absolutely.
So organic crops that use chemicals should have chemicals, and by the way, they should include the organic or naturally occurring chemicals. So like this could never end. So aflatoxin, mycotoxin, E. coli, salmonella, all should be tested. Well, you know what that would do to
No, I'm not saying that at all. That's not what I'm saying.
But those are important. I mean, mycotoxins and aflatoxin, if you're talking about labeling and you say you want crops labeled because there might be a chemical residue, there always was
added chemicals.
Well, again, toxicity is all about the quantity, right? Water can be toxic to you if you drink too much. So toxicity is all about the amount that you ingest. So the amount that we ingest over time in conventional crops, before GE, we were ingesting chemicals. Do we know what that was? Do we want to go back to those days? I'm surmising that I don't. I would rather eat a GE crop than one that I was growing in the 70s and the 80s. Because I know that I'm using a lot less chemical on it. To me, it's much safer than a crop that I was growing in the 70s and the 80s. So if you say that you have to label genetically modified crops, you're implying that they're dangerous.
Well, we don't know that they're not. I mean, do you have any evidence that they're not?
But you don't know that an organic crop that you're eating isn't dangerous. They can be very dangerous.
Really, very dangerous.
Aflatoxin levels in organic
peanut. And what are you saying aflatoxins in?
Aflatoxin, naturally occurring carcinogens.
I know what an aflatoxin is.
So it can be.
What are you concerned about? Because
well, I'm concerned about the long term. So
what produce are you concerned about?
If I eat organic peanut butter,
right,
and
it's only peanuts. The aflatoxin is a peanut issue.
Yeah, but
it's not a broccoli issue.
You'll have higher aflatoxin levels in organically grown corn, for example, because you can't clean off the diseases off organically grown corn. It's going to have higher aflatoxin levels, absolutely. So if that's the case, then the case for labeling GM crops is fear-based. It's not science-based.
Well, we don't have evidence that genetically modified foods are safe and that they're not contributing to a lot of diseases we've seen rapidly growing on the rise since the mid-90s when they've been introduced.
But
So
as
people
organic
unwittingly,
food,
people unwittingly
Yep.
were ingesting. They went from soy milk or soybeans and corn, and suddenly mid to late 90s, we're seeing the introduction of genetically modified soy and corn. And by the way, if you look at graphs that actually done at MIT, so there's the Artificial Intelligence Department has been looking at graphs of disease rates that have skyrocketed since the introduction of genetically modified foods, specifically Roundup Ready and BT corn.
And
so
autism rates absolutely correlate with the increased consumption of organic food in North America. Absolutely, 100% parallel the lines.
All food was organic before 1935. So if you're saying
but
that
as organic consumption of organic produce has increased, so has autism.
Well, organic consumption increased
is that causation or
that
correlation?
That was a backlash.
Yeah.
Okay, so organic consumption increased as a backlash because people didn't want to buy genetically modified food,
so
and you know that.
If people want to have choice, they do. Today they do. And I question that choice because earlier I said that I think the future of agriculture is genetically modified organic food production. And I think that there should not be a separation between the organic and the genetic engineering world. I think that should be a coming together.
Well, then you're not leaving nature alone. There's a group of people that don't want that. I don't want that. I don't want to eat something that's been genetically modified.
They haven't left nature alone because of the very reason of the earlier ways that foods are
But that is nature.
Bred.
That's how it's always
really?
been done.
Like nuclear bombardment? and mutagenesis with
Organic
chemicals?
food, that is not found in organic food.
Tony, over 2,400 to 3,000 varieties. I know it's 2,400, but it's approaching 3,000 varieties that are sanctioned to be grown organically owe their origin to mutagenesis.
Oh, their origin.
Yeah.
So are you talking about, first of all, nuclear
but
radiation is our background. There's background nuclear radiation.
But you can't
from the
take
Earth.
a seed and subject it to nuclear radiation or to chemical bombardment and change the genetic structure to mutate it and say that that is a safer process than what we're doing with RNAi or DNA. Or RNA or
but you know
transgenic.
that all seeds, even before 1935, have been subjected to background nuclear radiation because that is the nature of our Earth.
That is not purposeful. What I'm talking is the purposeful mutation of seeds that now find their way into the organic food supply. I think those should be labeled.
Okay, then that's a good point.
I think
There's plenty of people who look, and most of the organic farmers I buy from are using heirloom seeds.
Heirloom seed from where? If you go backwards in what does heirloom seed mean? And where did heirloom, how far back do we go?
16, 17, 1800s, 1900s.
And it's totally been non-altered.
Well, I wonder how in the 16,
I wonder the long-term studies are on that. I don't know.
Well, they've been eating them for hundreds of years. And so the thing is this, you brought up autism, and I don't know, but if you're implying that organic food increases the rate of autism.
I'm just saying that people say that, and to me, some of those correlations are preposterous. I mean, they lay two graphs together and they say there's the reason. Well, we really don't know.
We really don't know is what you were going to say. We really don't know.
The reason that autism is going up. Is it correlated to organic consumption of food? It seems.
Well, all food was organic before 1935, so we would have had the same rates of autism if it was due to eating organic food.
Maybe, but I'm just saying that there's an example of a ridiculous graph, is what I'm trying to point out.
Well, that's a ridiculous argument.
It is. Yeah.
Again, one could argue that the backlash, the organics become so popular, it's a backlash against being forced to buy genetically modified food.
Back to the label issue on today, if they want to buy non-GMO, they can. There are some projects out there that are verifying or trying to verify. I don't even know how they do it.
No, there are, yeah.
There are. So from a standpoint of the FDA's responsibility is, are foods safe? Yes. Foods are safe
based on
according to all the testing that has been done to bring those seeds to marketplace, which is onerous and
do you know what those studies are in terms of health? In terms of feeding, like what is that study? Are they feeding it to mammals? Are they feeding it to people?
Tony, I can't correlate I can't bring out the studies in my head. I don't have them there. But the fact of the matter is, mutagenesis and conventionally grown crops don't have to go through those studies, and all GE crops do. So they're under far more scrutiny than conventional breeding or mutagenesis generation of seeds. Far more scrutiny. And if people want to have a non-GMO crop, they can have it. They can buy a non-GMO crop with one of the non-GMO projects. You know, to me, this is almost getting out of hand. One of my favorite cereals is Cheerios. I love Cheerios, especially Honey Nut Cheerios. Love them. And now they've gone and they're non-GMO Cheerios, okay? Well, think about that. Cheerios are made of oats. There is no genetically modified oats on the marketplace. So what are they really?
Well, that's like saying no cholesterol in olive oil. There's never been cholesterol in olive oil.
But now they have non-GMO Cheerios. So what is it that's non-GMO about Cheerios today?
The sugar.
Sugar. So they took out sugar and they took out maybe some of the anti-caking agent that may come from corn and stuff like that. They took out some other ingredients because in the process, the Cheerios have shrunk by about 4 ounces. Cost has gone up, and the nutritional density inside the Cheerios has gone down.
The cost of Cheerios and the other non-GMO cereals in Europe have not gone up. In fact, they're cheaper in most of the European markets than they are here. I think that they had to reconfigure their formulation here, and so the public is bearing the price right now, bearing the brunt of that cost.
But that cost is not going to end. And if we talk about labeling, again, get back to this. This is a good point. So if we label, why do we label? Because there is fear of genetically engineered crops, so we should label.
We wouldn't have traceability for problems unless we label. So if we want to do a long-term study, even a survey of people who eat conventional, which now conventional really means GMO, even though in farming terms it doesn't, but people who eat conventionally versus people who eat avoiding GMOs. If we want to really do that long-term study, then we need to label, because there's no traceability without labeling. And it's one big experiment. So if we want to end this argument once and for all, like 10 years from now, 15, 20 years from now, which we could do if you really think it's important to feed the world, then you should be for labeling, because then there's traceability, and then those studies can be done,
Yeah, but
we'd have the answer.
I'd be for labeling if anybody could demonstrate to me that there's a danger in the genetically engineered corn or soybeans or canola that I'm consuming today. And I can tell you that my confidence level, and so I haven't exhaustively read, but I can tell you that I'm probably better read than the average Joe on the street, and I can tell you that my confidence level in eating the crops that we grow today is very, very high. I have a high confidence level. Now, if people want to buy non-GMO, they have that choice. There's the projects out there that are labeling non-GMO food, and they can do that. Alternatively, if they want to go organic and non-GMO, and again, they can do that. Now, organic food is a label right now. It's not a safety thing. It's a label. It's a marketing label. That's what it is. And I have no problem with it. People want to eat that way. That's just fine. I won't spend the extra money myself personally. I won't spend the extra 65 to 200% to buy organic. I do buy organic sometime, but it's for packaging preferences. So the choice already exists today. The FDA, and there's a recent study that just came out in April of 2014 by CAST. I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's a group out of Iowa that did a deep dive into the cost of labeling. And they figured out that the cost of labeling would be at least $500 per family per year or higher, and a lot of the costs aren't quantifiable yet.
I'd like to know who CAST is supported by and funded by, because there's been very similar studies done by groups that say just the opposite.
That it wouldn't cost anything to label.
Right.
Well, the cost would be there.
Because if they're selling to the European market, they have to have the chain of, they have to know what, it's all verified anyway. They have to keep it verified if they're selling into a lot of the European and foreign markets that don't want any GMO. So these big farms and these big companies actually
Again, the whole premise here that you're coming at me on is that the premise is that it has to be labeled because it's dangerous.
No. What I'm saying is, you're telling me you have confidence that GMO is not dangerous, and I'm telling you, from a science standpoint, the only way you can say there's something called attributable rate. You're saying the attributable rate, or the cause that GMOs have on disease, is 0 or close to 0, right? What I'm saying is, from a science standpoint, if you do statistics, doesn't matter what your science is, there's something called attributable rate. You're telling me the attributable rate looks like it's 0. In order to know that for sure, you must look at a population exposed to what you're talking about and look at their disease rates, and you must compare that to an unexposed population and look at their disease rates. And there's no way around that. That is the only way to say.
If you compared the population of Kenya and their death rate to the population of America, you can't do that.
You can't do that. But in America, what I'm telling you is that you can't make the statement. It's impossible. Now, to make a statement that GMOs are safe long-term on human health.
But you can't make a statement saying that they're unsafe.
That's right.
You can't say that.
But that's kind of a ridiculous argument, isn't it? You can't say they're safe, and therefore we shouldn't assume they're safe.
But the whole campaign around labeling is around fear-mongering.
No, it's around the traceability. It's about the liability and the traceability, and we want to know what the long-term studies are. So if we really want to know, and you're so confident that there's not a problem, then let's do that study. Let's get everything labeled, and let's have a long-term study and in 20 years look back at the disease rates on the people who eat it versus the people who don't. That's a really simple study that wouldn't cost anything. It's just labeling. So the people, the consumers who want labeling, and the scientists and the physicians who want labeling, want it for the very reason that they want traceability. We want to look at this long term in a progressive study, okay? A long-term study where we follow groups of people who have no problem, like you, eating genetically modified food. And then there's many people who are not going to be eating genetically modified food. They're going to be buying organic food because they want to know for sure that it's not genetically modified. But then you have to talk about your Food and Drug Administration policy in the United States. You're getting back to policy issues here, because the Food and Drug Administration, as I understand its role, is to protect the public by making sure that the food they eat is safe. But they haven't made sure genetically modified food is safe. Because
absolutely.
They haven't, because the only way to do that is to do the study I just told you about.
There's no well, again, those crops coming to market have gone under far more scrutiny than any other crop coming to market.
They're not fed to people and looked at long-term health effects. They're not. That is not what it goes through. So the only way to say it's safe.
So the only way to prove this is to put it through a human study. That's the only way to prove it.
That is the only way to prove. Well,
so
yes.
How do we get all our drugs registered, and how do we get everything else registered? Are there not toxicology studies and protocols that are defined? Are there not?
The studies have to go through phase 1 and phase 2 trials, and phase 2 trials are always, with exception, and that's something we're talking about in the film, but theoretically, and what they've always been, and
right.
that's changed, is that comparing that drug in question. So the phase 1 is usually comparing it with another drug, people who have the same disease. The phase 2 is comparing it against a placebo, which theoretically is sugar, right?
I guess.
And so we do compare drugs, theoretically,
Yeah.
to a placebo that doesn't have any of the drug and look at the long-term effects, at least for 2 to 5 years, on what diseases people develop based on taking that drug. So your point is that that's how it does work for drugs. Now, it doesn't work that way for genetically modified food.
But why are you treating that one special? Why are you treating that food special? Why is that one being singled out when I could give you, and I have given you, several examples of foods that I think are at higher risk than the GM foods?
Well, we don't know that they're at higher risk, but I agree that those other foods, anything that's done through intentional mutation with radiation and chemicals, I agree with you. I agree that they should be labeled as such.
If you just said that, if you just agreed with that, then we have got to put a whole bunch of our crops through long-term testing. Because
no, label them. Label them.
No, but then it should be tested to prove that they're safe.
Well,
so
that's
you
never
don't
going
know.
to happen financially.
Well,
for
you don't know that the long-term effects of a mutagenesis-generated seed is safe or not. So unless you put it through a long-term trial.
Right,
it's the same argument.
Right. No, the argument I'm making is not put it through a long-term trial, is label it. Label it as such so we can follow.
So you can put it through a long-term trial.
Yes, so we can follow.
But that's the same thing you should be saying on mutagenesis.
I'm saying that I don't have a problem with that, having those labels. So we can trace them.
I disagree with you, and respectfully disagree with you because from a farming level, and this is why I'm here today, I'm not a doctor, PhD, I'm not a medical expert, but from a farming standpoint, an agricultural standpoint, I know what I'm putting on the crop today and how I'm growing that crop is vastly different than it was in the 80s. And I don't want to go backwards to that. And our technology is far better today. I'm safer. I'm more confident in the food that we're eating today. Again, I'm not a doctor, but the issue here is questioning the policies and the safety record or the system of the FDA. And I can't comment on that other than that body in the United States and that body in Canada has been in charge of and responsible for the safety of our food supply. That's what its job is. And so if there's a question mark around their track record or question around their methodology, then I'm saying that should be applied to all technologies, all crops, organic, conventional, GMO, long-term studies, mutagenesis. Let's get it all on the table. I worry that we're throwing out one of the most promising technologies to feed the 9 billion people coming on the planet because of fear. And the technology is not understood well by people. But as you look into it, my confidence level didn't diminish. My confidence level went up. I've learned more about it, and as I learn more about it, I'm going, heck, I don't want to go back to this other system. I like where we're at and where we're going. Is it perfect? Do we know everything? Absolutely not. Never do, right? There's always the next thing that comes. But my confidence level in what we're doing is very high.
Greg, tell us about your background. How did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, so my name is Greg Horn. I started off in the health food industry when I was 15 and a half years old. I read a book called Sugar Blues that my mom had up on a bookshelf and told about how sugar was damaging your health. And I was a typical teenager, so I stopped drinking sodas, stopped eating candy, and cut out a lot of sugar. And I felt so much better, so visceral a connection between nutrition and health that I decided with the certainty that only a 15-year-old can have that I wanted to go into this business and make that my career. And that led me to a fantastic career in the health and nutrition area. First at GNC, General Nutrition Centers, which is the largest retailer in the world of nutrition supplements. I was there for 11 years. I left as a CEO. When I left there, I started a company called Specialty Nutrition. I scratched out one word and kept going, and I've had fantastic clients, including companies that I've actually been the interim CEO of during transition periods, like Garden of Life, which is the #1 organic, non-GMO certified brand in the health food channel to this day. So I specialize in science-based nutrition that can have a serious impact on people's health, and you can measure it.
What is your view, just as an overview, what's your view of GMOs?
So GMOs, genetically modified organisms. If you talk to scientists in these biotech labs, these biotech companies, which I've done, they'll tell you that these genetically modified crops in particular help feed the world and improve the economics for farmers, and both of those things are probably true. And so you have a lot of enthusiasm and a passion around feeding more people with less land in these labs. And that was really the original green revolution in the 70s, right? We're going to feed the world, and the Malthusian predictions did not come true. So now time has gone by, and now you have over 90% of many of our food crops are genetically modified foodstuffs. And my concern lies primarily in the area of the application of very toxic herbicides like glyphosate, which is Roundup, and very heavy pesticides to kill insects that end up on these crops and ultimately in the food supply, at the base of the food supply.
So is it, in your mind, is it well established that the toxicity of these herbicides or pesticides are showing to have adverse health effects in the population?
Well, first of all, anything with the word "icide" at the end means you're trying to kill something, right?
Yeah, right.
That's what icide means. So an herbicide is trying to kill a certain type of plant, and a pesticide is trying to kill a pest, an insecticide, an insect, et cetera, a fungicide, a fungus. So these are chemicals designed to kill things. Like, let's get that straight from the very beginning. So the fundamental question I have is, do you want more or less of that on your food? Chemicals specifically designed and engineered to kill things. And what these GM crops do in many cases is increase the resistance so that the particular plant, like the corn or the soybean or the canola, in the case of Roundup and glyphosate, is actually resistant to that, so they can kind of spray at will, and it kills the other weeds, but you also have to imagine that a lot of it ends up back on your food.
Everything's got its roots that start somewhere, and you've been around this industry in nutrition, health, and green living for a lot of years. So how did this whole thing get started? You know, what's the genesis of it?
So you have to go back to the roots of chemical warfare, basically. So
Chemical warfare?
Chemical warfare, yes. So, and it was used in World War I, and in World War II there was big advances in chemical warfare. Mm-hmm. And Monsanto was already making PCBs, and they were already making nuclear weapons. During the World War II, they made nuclear weapons, they made polystyrene. So they had this expertise at killing things with chemicals. Like, that's an expertise that they had.
Right.
And there's a pretty long list, DDT. So they're making these pesticides.
Did they make Agent Orange?
Agent Orange, yeah, that was that was a Monsanto product at one point during the Vietnam War period. So you have this expertise at killing things, and that expertise after World War II got directed towards increasing farm productivity through having these chemicals that were originally designed to, can kill insects and can kill other things. So that's kind of the genesis of Monsanto is certainly involved, but other chemical companies getting involved in this area that's nicely named crop science, but it's really the application of very toxic compounds to crops. And the benefits are that they do kill bugs and they do kill weeds. So that's a net benefit to the farmer. When you then extrapolate that so that it's every crop, that's when the unintended consequences can start. And I remember this. I went to a meeting in the mid-90s, a strategy session presentation on their strategy that Monsanto had. It wasn't confidential, I think it was just a public seminar. It was in Chicago. And they talked about how they were going to get rid of their petroleum-based chemical fertilizer and industrial chemicals business and focus instead specifically on genetically modified seeds that were resistant to their pesticides. And I came up, it was a fairly small group, small enough that you could come up to the speaker afterwards, and I said, hey, there'll be riots in the streets if you do this. Like, you should keep the chemical business. Like, why would you risk your entire business on the premise that the American public is going to take, with lying down, genetically modified foods specifically designed to match up to your pesticides? Like, that's not going to happen. And I was completely wrong. Obviously, if you fast forward now, it's 90+% of the soybean, canola, cotton, corn crop in this country are now GM, genetically modified seeds. Most of them are designed to be resistant to glyphosate, which is Roundup. And there were no riots in the streets. There were in other countries. There were in France. New Zealand never let them in. Other countries never let them in. But in the US, that actually never happened. So it turns out it was a brilliant strategy. It was an intentional strategy. It wasn't a closed-door conspiracy. They told people what they were doing, and then they did it.
Should there be riots in the streets?
It's interesting because now, because my own personal perspective is shaped more from the health food business, health food person. And so from that standpoint, the health food conscious people, health food store shoppers, for example, are recently in the last 8 or 10 years waking up to the idea that this is almost all the food supply. And it's a little late. And now that it's a niche market, there's niche brands and niche companies that are chasing after it that people are flocking to. Non-GMO certified independently is a big deal now to consumers. But I remember this would have been the late 90s. I think Monsanto split off their chemicals business in like 97 or something like that, about 97. So after that, the crops were starting to come out, and we had customers. I was in charge of GNC at the time. We had customers calling in saying, I don't want genetically modified soybeans in my soy protein or growth hormone in my whey protein. And so I called our contact at Archer Daniels Midland. Remember, I'm running GNC, and I said, hey, we only want our soy protein to come from, from non-genetically modified. We don't want to experiment with this with our customers. Our customers don't want it. And they said, hey, Greg, that's great, but we can't ship you that. I said, well, why not? Like, we're the biggest seller of this protein in the world for supplements. They said, no, we can't because it's deemed safe. We don't separate the soybeans that are GMO and the soybeans that are not in the silos when they store it. So when they go to process it, they don't know the difference. So this is the late 90s. It was already kind of intermingled into the food supply. And the idea of segregation, you had to wait a year so they could literally put it in a different grain silo. That's when I had a feeling that this was probably unstoppable. And at that time, the GM crops were only maybe, 15, 20% of the crops, not 90.
When you had that conversation, did it lead you to any particular action or any particular agenda that was different than before that conversation when you had this realization, holy crap, this stuff is intermingled, you can't kind of unring the bell, what's going to happen?
Well, there's a selfish answer to that. For GNC's business, we ordered stuff a year out that was separated so that we'd have non-GMO protein powder from the stuff we wanted. So that was proactive business step. From a personal standpoint, I started seeking out products that didn't have that. I didn't want to do that experiment with myself. That certainly didn't stop it from taking over the broad marketplace. And I was really surprised that there wasn't the same kind of passion that people are bringing to it now, that it's a small fraction of foodstuffs you have to do a special process and be independently validated through a service to show that it's non-GMO. Like, that used to just be called food.
Yeah.
Non-GMO food used to just be called food.
Right.
Not that long ago, 20 years ago. And so now people are looking for more real food, but the horses you can't unring the bell, as you mentioned. So all you can do as a person, if you care about this stuff, is actually just avoid it yourself and look for those independent seals and look for less processed food.
And it's interesting because you're saying, that used to be called food. Now we have to characterize food based on technology. And it's interesting too, because it seems very cultural. As you said, there are many areas of the world where they said, we don't allow GMO products to come in here. Yet where we are in North America, it's ubiquitous and it's almost inescapable. If you were to put on your crystal ball hat and gaze into it and say, where's this all going? Because there is this certain counterculture that's saying, we're very disturbed by this. There seems to be some malfeasance and conspiracy surrounding, the whole thing relative to Monsanto and other manufacturers and what their agendas are, et cetera. Where do you think this is going?
I think the genetically modified crops are here to stay. I mean, it's not just because of Monsanto making a $1.9 billion profit off pesticides and a $6.2 billion profit off the genetics of the seeds. A lot of crops don't go into food. So 40% of the U.S. corn crop, for example, goes into the creation of fuel, ethanol that you burn in your tank. And another 36 or so percent of that last year went into feed. So feeding animals that need the grain.
What are some of the implications there?
Well, we'll get back to that in a second.
Okay.
So for human consumption, you're left with the other, whatever that is, 24%, I guess, of the corn goes into some kind of food crop. But 94%, I think, is GMO. So I think probably the best we can do now in terms of practical application for the food supply is to have genetically preserved foods be our human consumption foods. I don't think it matters quite that much whether the corn that we're growing is GM if you're going to burn it up anyway. I just like to see that segregated, and in my own personal life, that's what we try to do is segregate like the food quality stuff versus the stuff that's going into fuel. So the farmers can get a higher yield on fuel, but I'd really rather have something that's much more close to natural than genetically modified for the food side of it.
And this becomes a slippery slope, though, right? Because you have kind of this crossover effect where, we have a field over here for fuel, and we're going to spray it like crazy, and we're going to, it's going to be GMO. But over here's the field that's for consumption. How do you try to create the separation when pretty much you can't because of winds blow and cross contamination of crops, and suddenly you've got a challenge or an issue. So is there any proposed solution to that particular dilemma?
So first of all, this idea of cross-pollination is, you don't know that's an unintended consequence. Yeah. And there's been cross-pollination since the dawn of plants on the earth, right? They've always been cross-pollinating. The difference now is that you have a man-made insertion variant that's now cross-pollinating, and so that's got unknown consequences. The idea of segregation of genetically modified and non-GMO foods is a really powerful one, and going back to the late 90s when we did that for GNC at the silo level with ADM, and they did it for us, all the way through to what we're doing in our own family where we're demanding to have non-GM and more organic foods that we consume. That's very powerful. I think the awareness of non-GMO went through a little bit of a dip. So it was kind of under the radar, and then people kind of heard about it but didn't care, and now they're caring a lot. And that consumer demand and voting with your dollars on what you purchase is incredibly powerful at shaping markets and demand, because if farmers have more demand for non-GM crops, that's what they're going to plant, that's what they're going to grow. So you got to tap into the economic systems. I don't think you're going to put the genie back in the bottle in terms of genetic engineering.
I want to circle back to something that you said earlier that really got my attention, because the genesis of something, the values out of which something is created, the intention, sort of infuses the spirit in it and sends it off into its future. And you said that the companies, especially Monsanto, I think you cited, that their original business was waging chemical warfare, and that they were literally waging chemical warfare on humans. So it was basically the United States government's involved in wars, World War II, Vietnam, large-scale wars, and these people were charged with the intention and the duty, if you will, to create chemicals that can kill human beings. So war sort of goes away, human-on-human war, and they say, well, let's now adjust our sights on something other than humans. Let's put it on plants, on pests, and wage chemical warfare there. And if you look at just the fundamental construct of the idea of waging a war, make it chemical warfare, and pointing at different types of species, not just humans, on the planet, doesn't the overall construct just seem like something that could be kind of radical and have long-term, very adverse, toxic, dangerous effects in the world?
So the chemical warfare metaphor is perfect. So there was these plants that were designed to make chemicals, and the war's over, and we need a new enemy. Yeah. And the new enemy is insects. The new enemy is weeds. And that's a legitimate enemy. And they repurposed those, both the chemistry knowledge as well as the productive capacity, towards killing a new enemy. And the new enemy was the things that ate our crops. And it worked. They are winning the war. So these chemicals are very effective at killing the bad stuff. And in the short term, that's what you care about, right? The question is, how do you win the peace? A war is a short-term phenomenon, hopefully. So what happens afterwards? And afterwards, we just kept using more and more of this, and we actually upped the ante to change the biological nature of the seed. This is life sciences, so that it would actually be more resistant to the chemical warfare. Right. Which brings up the question, now that we're in peacetime, what do those biological changes within the seed mean once you consume them in terms of your biology and the food supply? And what residual of that pesticide or herbicide that remains in the plant, what residual effect does that have on your own biology? And that's an unanswered question.
And wouldn't it make sense to answer that question before you unleash this into the world, in a irretrievable way?
Well, carrying through your warfare analogy, you're just trying to get the war won, right? And there's going to be casualties, and that is, once you win, you vanquish the enemy, and then you can figure that out later. After the war, there's time to rebuild, but you got to win, right? That mentality applied to crops and pests and weeds is a never-ending battle, because it's a co-evolution. As the pesticides get better and as the herbicides get better, the plants and the insects get better. And so there's an arms race of a different kind happening, where eventually there's resistance that starts happening to these things, and you need more and more and more of them. And where the life actually originates is not just in the seed, it's also in the soil that the seed is grown in, and that gets decimated as well. So you could say that we're actually, our current food supply, as a result, almost a casualty of this chronic chemical warfare that's the base of our food chain.
And that's, really some of the questions about unintended consequences, and that it seems that it's irretrievable, that you can't get back to a neutral set point, to do a do-over. And so you're saying there's this evolutionary battle or process. But let's talk about that. I mean, what are the implications to the soil? If you start wiping out, in a massively effective way, insects, what does that mean to, as far as the ripple effects to the bird population, to, other such things, that there's a balance in nature that if we go and just destroy it in this massive way, aren't we in a compromised situation that we might not be able to recover from?
Well, we're already living in a very engineered environment, and we're already, as a human species, dependent on our own engineering for everything from infrastructure for power plants and dams and rerouting rivers to the agricultural system. So we have that problem already. My question is, how can you protect your own health and the health of people in light of the fact that we've already engineered our environment? And I don't think you want to go all the way back, because winning the war has increased yields, and it has done some good things for feeding the world. There's much higher yields with these products that go into things other than food. When it comes back to food, though, the biology interaction between what you're eating that's been genetically modified or the pesticide residue on that, and how your own biology interacts is unknown. That experiment is still unfolding, and so there's another kind of coevolution there, and that coevolution might mean that we're just getting sicker. If you look at some of these correlations, and correlations don't prove anything definitively, but they're eye-popping on how some health conditions and diseases have skyrocketed as we've been applying these pesticides and eating these GM seeds as the base of our food supply.
Do you think that we have enough of a context for this, or are we still sort of in this experimental realm, wondering what the implications are.
We're in the largest uncontrolled experiment in human history. There's been over 70,000 new chemicals introduced into our environment just in the last 100 years. We've started eating foods that we genetically modified ourselves only in the last 20 or 30 years. And nobody really knows what these cocktails that we absorb through our diet, through our air, through our water are really going to do. Or really, like, that is so uncontrolled. All the variables are all moving at the same time. So it's a big unknown, maybe the biggest unknown in our entire human history.
It's extraordinarily chilling, huh?
There's going to be a coevolution that happens while we adjust, but I don't know that the human metabolism can adjust at the same rate as the human ingenuity to introduce new toxic chemicals against legitimate enemies at the base of the food supply. So that interaction is so mind-boggling that the reaction that I have and other people who are interested in promoting non-GMO and organic foods is to go back to before that happened, to selfishly protect your own food supply. And if you apply that to a bigger system, the food supply, should it be subject to a giant uncontrolled experiment? Do you really want to do that experiment with your own health?
Let's now talk about that, because if you're somebody like me, my answer to the question is I don't want to subject myself or my family to what I think is a massive experiment that has deleterious effects on humanity at large and on individual human beings. And now I want to take action to try to safeguard my health and my family's health. And this is where obviously you're an extraordinary expert. You understand the macro view, but you've spent your life's energy really working on individual strategies that people can incorporate to live, I think, what you'd refer to as a green lifestyle, and especially on the nutritional side. Imagine that there's a mother out there who's taking responsibility for the health of her family. She's watching this and she's saying, "Oh my God, what do I need to do now?" To now make a shift in our behaviors so that we can try to safeguard ourselves against the threat that is here. So what's the low-hanging fruit for, not somebody who's sophisticated and, and has understood this stuff for 10 or 20 years, but is starting out on that path? What would you suggest to them?
The first thing you can do to protect yourself is don't trust anyone. Don't. Yeah. You don't need to anymore. Yeah. In the age of the internet and transparency and independent certification, you don't need to trust anyone. Don't trust me. Don't trust Pat Gentempo. Don't trust anybody. Look for independent certifications that are validated through a firm that has no, just other than paying a certification fee, doesn't have any economic interest in the success or failure of the product. When I first started in the organic food industry, there were 31 different certifiers, and we needed one. And so that's a case of we actually went to the government and said to USDA, come up with the standards that can be independently verified, not by the company, because we don't want to trust anybody. And organic, that organic round seal with the farm on it that says organic, is now one of the best known brands in the world because it's independently certified. Mm-hmm. The non-GMO project is another case where it's independent. They come and they look at every component of a packaged food or even a simple food. And if you see that seal, you know that it doesn't have any genetically modified organisms in there. So not trusting anybody is a big idea. The second is to eat as simple and as low on the food chain as you're comfortable with. So if you can read the ingredient panel and you understand what those are, or a whole apple is better than applesauce, even if it's the only ingredient is apple because it's been processed. Mm-hmm. So the lower you can be on the food chain when you're eating, the more you're not letting chemicals concentrate on their way up the food chain into higher and higher forms that can be more toxic. The third thing I think is just to prioritize. I mean, with the internet, there's lots of lists. The Environmental Working Group puts out the list. The Monterey Bay Aquarium puts out a list of safe seafood, and the Dirty Dozen is the Environmental Working Group's list that show you how to prioritize. So, like for pesticide and herbicide avoidance, things like berries should be a big priority. Anything where they would spray the fruit directly with a chemical to kill a bug, and then you eat the fruit, that's the one to spend the extra money for to buy organic. So there are simple ways you can protect yourself and make that choice to not do the wide-scale uncontrolled experiment on yourself, your health, and your family.
You have a personal story that I think gives you great empathy and a sense of purpose around this particular subject. Can you share that?
Sure. I was at GNC. I was the head of GNC, and we had a lot of success there, and we moved into this brand new office building with new furniture made out of pressboard and new wallpaper and new carpets and new foam everywhere in the furniture, and flame retardants on the nice wood paneling in my office, and I had the corner office, and I got sick. And I didn't really know what it was at first, but my energy was low and I couldn't function. I had brain fog. It was achy. There's a whole bunch of symptoms, and I realized that I was later diagnosed with chemical sensitivities, which is a loss of tolerance for synthetic chemicals in the environment. So fortunately, I had access to the world's leading experts on health and nutrition. So I used that to my advantage and created essentially a self-study program, which I later wrote a book called Living Green, which is when you're talking about how to live less toxic life in a fairly toxic world. And so this is a personal passion of mine. I can't function without living this way because of my health, so it's a deeply personal issue for me. And so I do a combination of diet, lots of different kinds of exercise, but also I take certain nutrients and fibers that help detoxification of toxins that you can't avoid. They're already in your system. And detoxification in a chemistry sense happens in your liver. So you want to make sure that you have enough of the substrates that your liver is functioning properly to change one molecule to another. You also want to reduce your load of some of these chemicals are actually obesogens. So an obesogen is something that within your body triggers a hormonal response that makes you fat. And the xenoestrogens, so estrogens that originate outside your body, is one of these classic chemicals, and they're in lined cans that are BPA. They're in receipts that they can stick into your skin. It's not just in water bottles and that type of thing. So once they're in your body, you want to detoxify those, and that happens in your liver. So there's certain fruit and vegetable extracts, broccoli extracts, and other substrates that help your liver actually do that better, so that you're actually detoxifying. And then fibers, having a fiber-rich diet helps carry that away. So I would recommend that to people who are worried about toxicity issues, eating low on the food chain and making sure your diet includes these substrates that help you detoxify the things that you can't avoid absorbing.
So is there good news in the sense of saying, well, there's something that I can do that can help to undo the damage that has been done, where there's regenerative ability of the body if you do, as you said, reduce the load, detox, that you can get your body back on a track where it can start to express better health, as that might have been compromised as a consequence of this whole environment that we're talking about here.
The human body is an amazing thing. And I've gone from waking up every night literally drenched in sweat and barely being able to function to functioning at a very high level and really not feeling any health problems as long as I stick to, first, avoidance. So you try to avoid as much as you can out there, and eating clean food. It's organic and non-GMO is actually a big part of that. But there's other things you can do. These nutrients that I'm talking about, especially this broccoli extract, make a big difference in my own health. Making sure that your mitochondria and your cells have the right kind of energetic substrates is really important, and there's nutrition solutions for that. And having enough fiber so that you're keeping things moving through your system. The average American eats 15 grams of fiber, and the recommendation is 30 grams. So on average, we're getting about half as much as we need, and that can make a huge difference in your ability to detox and eliminate.
So Greg, I want to say thanks very much for taking the time to sit down with us out of your busy schedule. And any final thoughts before we conclude?
What I found is that these issues start at a very personal and passionate level, at the level of the individual. And that's very powerful, because if you're choosing to protect your own health through organic foods and through non-GMO foods and what you put in your body and how you treat your body, that has power and ripple effect back to what types of crops are grown to service that demand. So I would say it sounds selfish, but start with yourself and the quality of the food that you're able to eat for now and in future generations.
Thank you very much. I hope you got a lot out of episode 7 of our 9-episode series here with GMOs Revealed. Tomorrow we have in our episode Jerry Curatolo and Stephanie Seneff. Now Jerry is a dentist. You might say, well, what does a dentist have to say about this? A lot. Actually, I was really pleasantly surprised. First of all, Jerry's quite a character. He really comes alive on camera and in the interview. But when you start to understand that you have a microbiome not only in your gut, but there's one in your mouth, and the relationship of that to your entire health, I think you're going to say, oh, I never understood that, but it certainly makes a lot of sense. So it's a really great interview. It's stimulating. Next, we have Stephanie Seneff, who is a senior scientist at MIT. And I got to tell you, she's a person that just knows the facts, states the facts, looks at the data, and sees the trajectory of where we're going. And what she has to say about this GMO issue is truly chilling. And you can't get any more credible than a senior scientist at MIT. So you want to be sure to see that particular presentation also. Tomorrow starts episode 8 of our 9-episode docuseries with GMOs Revealed. And on a personal note, I want to say it's been a privilege to take this journey with you. Our vision for GMOs Revealed is unbridled. We know that this information needs to get into the world, and I'd love for you to join us in this mission to get this information out and support us by owning GMOs Revealed. We have 2 packages, silver and gold. There's multiple options there with bonuses and other such things. This information is vital, it's valuable, and it's important. So I invite you to please share our vision, join our mission, own GMOs Revealed, and let's move forward into the world in a more empowered way.